So building your army in 40k 10th edition is changing massively. The force organisation chart is gone, chapters and sub-factions are dead as we know them, and power level is a thing of the past. Let's talk through the changes. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking about one of the meatiest rules previews for 10th edition so far. This one really does answer quite a lot of questions as to how we're going to be able to put together armies in the new edition, and in general, like some of the rest of the rules previews, it is very simple. Some big and slightly convoluted sections of Warhammer rules just basically getting the axe or getting tones down quite a bit. I think there's definitely some big positives for doing so, though arguably I think that some of these things that we're losing might be a little bit sad, so we'll go over the previews one by one. In terms of headline news for this, Games Workshop have actually published a section on mustering your army. They make the process super clear now, which I think is helpful. It wasn't actually a process that was enormously clear to beginners, and often the rules were spread out over multiple different things, such as the core rulebook, the codexes, and the mission packs, all of which could change things. In terms of headline news for the changes though, as mentioned, the sub-factions are basically gone. Things like Eldar Craft Worlds or Chaos Legions will generally play with the same rules now, and they're being replaced by Army of Renown style detachments, very similar in pattern to the World Eaters ones that we had when their codex came out, being either able to play standard World Eaters or the possessed disciples of the Red Angel. The Force Organisation chart has also bitten the dust as well. There's no differentiation between things like fast attack, heavy support and elites, and that's quite a big shake-up for something that's been with 40k for a very long time. It appears to be that the rule is just take one character, then more or less whatever, though they still keep the rule of 3 for each datasheet, and 6 for battle line troops and dedicated transport. And finally, perhaps another lesser casualty of all of this is that power level is gone. It certainly wasn't universally embraced, but a fair few people did build their list that way. It looks like it's points all the way now, probably something I'm in favour of overall. For me, this does answer a whole bunch of some of the bigger questions of 10th edition, though there's still a few bits that they kind of need to clarify, maybe things around certain special characters perhaps. Getting into it properly though, here is Games Workshop's new army building chart, a 6-step process for putting together a Warhammer 40k army, and really quite a straightforward one compared with the massive layers of special rules in 40k codexes in 9th. First up, they start with selecting your battle size, so this would be how many points it's supported. It looks like the main ones that they're going for in this edition are 1000, 2000 and 3000 points of regular 40k, kind of similar to the Incursion, Strike Force and Onslaught levels that we have at the moment. My suspicion is that when you're playing missions and things, they'll have tailored ones to those points levels to make the scoring make sense and things. I'd guess that as it is currently, this will probably also determine the size of the board that you're playing on. They're now also making the statement that they're saying that 500 points it will still be playable, but maybe not directly advised for mainline 40k. They're going to put most of their effort at that points level, the combat patrol level, into the actual versus box set game that we've talked about before. Pick up one of the actual combat patrol box sets and play them against each other. They recognise in the article that 500 point games of regular 40k can just be a bit skewed one way or the other, so trying to balance every single unit against each other in that is probably a bit of a hopeless task. And to be fair, there'd be nothing to stop you playing the 1000 point game rules just with 500 points if you wanted to. Then the bit about the army roster is basically just writing down your army list in one form or another. They say for this that you can just write it down on paper or something, or use their new upcoming 10th edition app, which hopefully will work a fair bit better than the 9th edition one, and have a more functioning army builder right from the get-go, which I think was perhaps a mistake for adoption in 9th. I honestly suspect that they'll have made their own job easier for them to design an app that works this time round, just due to this whole army building process being so much more simple than all the convoluted bits in 9th. Then for the other bits, which we'll go through in more detail in turn, you choose a faction next. These are pretty much as you'd expect, things like Death Guard, Chaos Space Marines, Adeptus Custodes or Imperial Guard could be your faction. And in this bit they've clarified that allies are going to remain kind of on the down low like in Arcs of Omen. Only a few fluffy choices that regularly ally like Freeblade Knights are going to be allowed in normal rules, though of course in more casual games you can certainly break them. Then the detachment rules basically do seem to be confirmed to replace sub-factions now. Multiple ways to play each faction, maybe more built around a certain theme of the army in terms of units that you're taking, as opposed to hailing from a particular chapter or craft world or something. Unit selection now dispenses with the Force Organisation chart. You just pick one character, then you get 0 to 3 of most non-unique choices, and then 0 to 6 of battle line units and dedicated transports. Finally, you nominate your Warlord, and certain characters can also get enhancements. These basically seem to be their versions of relics and Warlord traits now. Overall, I definitely like having the process all set and streamlined in these 6 steps here, makes it far more obvious for newer players, though I do feel like by hacking out certain sections of the list building experience, we are going to lose things as well as gain simplicity. First up then, let's focus on detachments and sub-factions. I feel like it is quite a major shake-up to basically confirm that there will be no major special rule for sub-factions in Warhammer 40k. It is very different to previously. It means that any non-unique units for say Salamanders or Ultramarines will play exactly the same on the tabletop. You wouldn't be getting things like the Ultramarines fallback and shoot, or the Salamanders buffs to their Melter and Flamer weapons. It also looks like gone will be things like unique warlord traits, relics and stratagems, all of which encourage you to play the Force in certain special ways, and when they're done right, they can add to a bit of list building variety in different factions. Say you're not just fighting Space Marines, you're fighting super fast and aggressive White Scars, or the brutal firepower of the Iron Hands. I feel like this is something that I did see coming, to be honest. I did a video about it a month or so back on the channel. Plus, when we saw the 10th edition datasheets and there was no Hive Fleet tag on the Termagant one, that did seem to imply that that might be the case. My previous guess was that there was going to be some sort of custom chapter type option, much like the Imperial Guard have at the moment. Pick 2 traits or born soldiers and off you go, rather than messing around with the other things like unique regiment traits and relics and things. But it seems that Games Workshop have been more drastic than that. It is just pretty much the Army of Renown type rules that we're getting with those detachments, and it's not going to matter which colour you've painted your Space Marines, or which seps your Tau forces are from or anything. Perhaps the biggest question mark at the moment are how any chapter locked things are going to work with the current system. Say, will you be able to take Rabute Gilliman alongside a Salamander's unique character and some Blood Angel Sanguinary Guard, for example? Is all of that going to be possible in one army, or are you going to have to select one of the 3 to go down where you can't take the rest? In general, I feel like the removal of sub-factions is going to be a bit sad for a fair few people, though it does have some benefits as well as downsides. I feel like a lot of people's initial reaction is going to be that we're losing some lore flavour for the way that different armies fight. I mean, it does feel quite appropriate to the fluff that, say, Imperial Fists are just extra good with bolters, or Blood Angels are enormously ferocious on the charge, whether they happen to be Intercessors or Death Company. I feel like with a lot of people used to some in-depth sub-faction rules at the moment, it might start to feel just a little bit bland when your standard battle line units just have the same profile as all the other different chapters out there. And even just for fluffy games, it could be a bit sad that you won't be seeing quite as much unique stuff on the tabletop compared with what we have now. When done right as well, it could genuinely push armies in different ways in competitive lists. Say a list of Black Templar Space Marines might fight very differently from a Blood Angels or White Scars one, for example. Though often it did have drawbacks, they'd usually work out being something that's just a bit better than most other things, say for example Bloody Rose Close Combat Sisters of Battle, or the Necron Dynasties that give them all the OBSEC. In general, while I feel like a few people might not be the biggest fans of it, I think there's still some big wins for the game as a whole here. For some armies that had a super recognisable colour scheme, like say the Space Marine chapters, it meant that if you painted them all up as Ultramarines, then people would usually expect you to use their rules for them. And when the chapter books aren't enormously well balanced, it just means that you're at a disadvantage compared with if you painted them another colour, and that could be a bit of a feels bad moment, say compared with another force where the sub-factions aren't as easily identifiable, like say Chaos Knights where most people don't know the colour schemes. So I'd say certainly for people just painting their miniatures up exactly how they like them, this does feel like a big win. You don't need to arbitrarily paint up your Space Marines as successors to be able to access the full set of rules if you want to. At least in 10th edition you'll be able to paint them up say as Imperial Fists and not get hamstrung with a weakish codex for the entirety of an edition. Another big win for this is that it will make Games Workshop's job balancing armies a lot easier than before. In 9th edition, balancing individual units can be an almost impossible job. If you've got a sub-faction that makes melee units massively more dangerous, then it's perfectly possible that a unit with 1 points cost could be kind of broken in that sub-faction, but then also kind of weak in another sub-faction that doesn't give them a big melee boost. If things are a bit more even out between each and every army, it should mean that Games Workshop should be able to internally balance codexes a bit better than they have before. Still though, I feel like this is one that's probably going to divide opinions. Let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments. In any case, the new style of sub-faction rules that we're going to be getting are these detachments. Games Workshop had kind of made clear what they were going to do already, but we've got a few more specific details now. Basically, as suspected, they are going to be working pretty similar to that World Eater's Army of Renown that they got in their late 9th edition book. A 2-page spread of rules where you get 1 or 2 basic passive buffs for the whole army. Then a set of 6 stratagems, with a lot of those being farmed out to the individual datasheets as special rules apparently. A set of things called enhancements, which are basically warlord traits and relics rolled into one, and some of these detachments will also have unit restrictions imposed upon them. Again, this is kind of similar to the Army of Renown, where you take a force that's themed around one particular section of the army, like maybe a Necron Destroyer cult perhaps, and the army's got to be mainly focused around those kind of units. At the rollout, it sounds like each army will just have one detachment, and then when they roll out the codexes, they'll add a bunch more. So say an army like Necrons might just have a standard detachment that represents them on a normal and fairly balanced army list, and then might have a destroyer-focused one, perhaps one that's built around the Silent King perhaps with a whole load of Triarch Praetorians, and maybe a Cult of the Cryptek type one with a whole load of Canoptek units, and then each of those detachments might replace some of the core army rules and then have a bunch of stratagems and enhancements that actually help those individual units. Sounds like there could be quite a lot of opportunity for creativity there. So say for example they could have a Space Marine First Company one that builds around Terminators. Just to illustrate this, they tell us that the Space Marines are going to be getting their generic one as a Gladius task force, and kind of interesting as that was a kind of battle company type formation back in 7th edition, so they're recycling the name a bit there. Apparently for this one, the passive buffs that they get are called Oath of Moment and Combat Doctrines, and from the preview it sounded like Oath of Moment might be something that's a Space Marine specific one that they get across a bunch of their different detachments, whereas Combat Doctrines are the thing that the Gladius force gets that other Space Marine detachments might sub out for something else. They also confirmed that there'll be a choice of just 4 character enhancements for this one, so even less than the World Eater's Army of Renown I suppose. Far less than the amount of warlord traits and relics that we get to pick at the moment. Overall, I think it is interesting. Rather than playing, say, Salamander Space Marines, you'd be playing Gladius Space Marines, or First Company Space Marines, or perhaps Gravis Company Space Marines, or something like that. On the one hand, I think it's kind of nice as it doesn't pigeonhole a chapter into just one style of play. You might say have an Ultramarines Fast Attack Company, and that might be expected to have a different fighting style, I suppose. Still though, I kind of feel like as themes, these different detachments are going to be a bit weaker. I feel like it's maybe a bit more exciting and lore relatable to say that I'm playing Space Marines with my Ultramarines, as opposed to I'm playing Space Marines with my Gladius Task Force. Still though, it certainly sounds interesting enough. Hopefully with fairly straightforward rules and just one sheet of page per army, they will be able to keep these somewhat balanced against each other, so there really are multiple different viable ways to play an army, rather than just being restricted to one of them obviously being the best. Then moving on to the next step, we've got unit selection, and this is really quite interesting as it's this system that's going to be replacing the force organization chart. Compared with messing about with multiple detachments or great big charts like the Arcs of Omen one, this one is just super simple to be honest. You start out by one character to lead the force. I guess for things like knights you'll probably be able to nominate one as a character as per their detachment rules. Then just about every data sheet in the army is going to be 0 to 3 selections. It doesn't look like there's any sort of hints like unit types or anything like that restricting which ones you can take, so at least it looks like on paper that you might be able to build some ridiculously skewed army lists, say take nothing but tanks, or nothing but big gun heavy support, or melee shock troops. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule though. Epic heroes can only be taken once each. In the little silhouette there we get a picture of Guilliman, so it very much looks like named characters to me. So you're not running around with multiple copies of, say, Vulcan Hestan or something like that. I'd guess that this would also apply to other once-only units, like say the Solitaire or perhaps the Avatar of Kane, or maybe the Space Marine Chapter Master if there's even still rules for that. Things that you might not expect to have more than one unit per army of. Then, if you do want to spam things a bit, the rules are a fair bit more relaxed for Battle Line units. Battle Line basically sounds like it's going to be the new version of Troops for 10th edition. My guess would be that everything that's troops at the moment would most likely get Battle Line in 10th, and then you can take 0 to 6 of those, or any dedicated transports. My guess would be that depending on the detachment, you might have a special rule that says a different type of unit gets Battle Line in this army. Just completely guessing, but say if you had a Craftworld Eldar detachment that allowed you to build around Aspect Warriors, you might well be able to take Aspect Warriors as Battle Line maybe, but you might be locked out of other choices within the Codex to make up for that. Also, if say we had a First Company Space Marine detachment, you might be able to get Battle Line Terminators perhaps, which I could certainly see them being the poster boys for 10th edition. I guess for troops and transports it could actually be kind of restrictive for at least a couple of armies that don't have much choice. I guess we don't know if Harlequins are going to be a bit more rolled into generic Eldari, but I feel like they could actually be an army that kind of struggles with just 6 of a unit, seeing as a lot of spam of troop squads plus their Star Weavers could actually mean that they struggle with these kind of limitations and are forced into other choices. Maybe it could be similar for other cheap transports like maybe Venoms in Drukhari perhaps. Overall seems simple and effective. Maybe I'll be a little bit concerned about things like people over-spamming one thing. Hopefully the way that the missions, stratagems and datasheets are set up will be enough to actually make people pushed into taking a decent variety of things rather than going spam on damage dealers or something. This new system though means that the force organisation chart is basically dead. Again, like sub-faction rules, I feel like this isn't going to be universally positively received. A force organisation chart where you take HQs, elites and troops and things, that's all been around since early Warhammer 40K, and it certainly could be one component in stopping people just going very heavy on spam of certain units and trying to force them into making armies that actually look like armies a bit by forcing an HQ and some troops, and then often having a bit of a trade-off for what other battlefield roles that you could take. You might have elites units competing against each other, or if you wanted to take, say, excessive fast attack, you might well have to trade off that with command points, at least for most of 8th and 9th. The system has changed a fair bit over the last few years. First up, we had detachments kind of generating you command points by taking along cheap battalions of Imperial Guard like the Loyal 32. Then they switched to costing you command points, basically meaning that CP was almost kind of tied to troops and HQs, as they were the ones that you used to unlock the command point free detachments like battalions and patrols. Then late in 9th edition we had the all-encompassing Arcs of Omen detachment, really quite a big and convoluted force organisation chart, but one that basically brought all the elements of the game together and actually made it work for every army, which I thought was quite a big win. My guess was that we're probably going to be seeing something with that in 10th, but it looks like again Games Workshop have gone even simpler than that. It is kind of interesting to think about how the changes are going to affect troops as well. One thing that GW stressed in their article was that troops have often been a bit of a tax in the past. You had to take a few of them because it made sense for the army with objectives secured, plus not giving up too many command points. But now again they can be completely ignored if you want to, so hopefully like in Arcs of Omen they've generally done enough to mean that you want to actually take some, though in this one they look like they've lost another big bonus in not having objectives secured and just getting a bit more of those objective control points. Again, I do feel like they may be putting a lot of pressure on themselves to get the datasheets exactly right and make sure that all of them are playable, because anything that's a bit underwhelming is going to be very easy to overlook when nothing is mandatory, and you don't really have too many things to put pressure on you to play any one unit. Overall, I think that the unit selection is an interesting system, very freeform, and you'll just be able to basically pick the units that you like the most and throw them into an army. I think the main challenge is just going to be not having armies that just devolve into massive spam of one sort of damage dealer, as often that'll be the most efficient thing to do on a raw damage and defense type game. Say for example, if your opponent can deal with one tank with their guns per turn, then taking something like 10 is going to give them some big problems. My guess is that they'll probably have anticipated past problems from coming up, like say mass spam of flyers zooming around to just demolish the enemy, or mass artillery deleting chunks of the enemy army with no way of returning fire. Plus it does sound like they've got a few ways of just incentivizing you to take maybe just one of a unit but not more, as apparently some of these datasheet specific abilities are going to be one use only, so it'll be less efficient to take two of them than just one. Fingers crossed between that and the objective control type points, there'll be enough stuff to make you want to take different units. Perhaps another small concern might be that if army construction rules are just super simple, the game might just start to look like a solved puzzle really quite quickly. I guess in an optimised 40k army list in the first place, you can get a fair bit of convergence on people running the same sort of things, but at least with quite complex army building, different sub-factions, and trade-offs with detachments and things, there's a bit more incentive to mix things up a bit and take some obscure combos that other people might not have been running. I kind of feel like armies like World Eaters at the moment do tend to have a bit of convergence on the exact same sort of army lists, at least for their optimised picks, and they very much seem to be an army that seems to represent this new system. Admittedly, maybe they're a bit of a bad example, as they just don't really have all that many units that use their core playstyle in the first place, and I guess if things do start to look a bit stale, Games Workshop will probably shake things up with points changes, making the best stuff a little bit less viable, and buffing the stuff that's too weak. I'll definitely be interested to hear your thoughts though, with sub-factions and the force organisation chart going. Do you think that the armies on the other side of the table are going to be looking interesting to fight, or less so? That's not all though, as we've got further clarifications to points, allies and characters. First up, the news that points are universal and power level is ultimately gone. Again, something that was kind of foreshadowed by their preview of that Termagant datasheet, as it didn't have a power level on it. Overall, I must admit, I probably won't miss power level as a mechanic. The idea behind it was just to have a very simple and straightforward way to get units onto the board. Though to be honest, I think that they kind of made it redundant in 9th edition, where they made points costs a lot easier to access than they were before. In 8th edition, they were a bit of a nightmare, recording bits of war gear on a completely separate page, and it took a lot of flicking around just to get the points in order for any one unit. I think power level was perhaps initially a good idea to give you an alternate system to get armies on the board just very roughly balanced, but then I think that simplicity was kind of undermined when they published in time massive tables or updated power levels, plus the fact that having two systems in the first place is perhaps a bit unhelpful for dividing the community as to how they play. And power level, just like points, could easily be gamed if you wanted to, as it never made sense to take anything but maximal war gear on every single unit, something that points tended to guard against, at least before the age of free war gear. Still though, I do feel again like some of the other changes, power level will be missed by the people who used it, though my suspicion is that points will probably be less fiddly in 10th edition, and they'll probably be even easier to use than they are now. So far we still need a fair few clarifications around how points are actually going to be used, but given the information that isn't on their datasheet, I suspect that we're going to get a table like this that Age of Sigmar has, a bit of an army construction table, where we get the unit sizes of the different units that you can field, how many points each model costs, and whether or not they're battle line or not. None of that information is on any of the datasheets, so it kind of makes sense that we need a table to provide it. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about this, though, is the implications it might have for war gear. In Age of Sigmar, just about all of the war gear is free, and I kind of suspect that in 10th edition a lot more war gear pieces might become free, potentially everything in the game if Games Workshop really goes hard on it. It is going to be interesting to see what that means for game balance, as I feel like there's just going to be some units where you have optimal loadouts, where it's just flat better to take some guns compared with others by a long way. I guess we'll wait and see on that front. Next we've got a clarification to allies. Basically allies are basically out for most of 10th edition, at least in the big deal way that we could do through most of 8th and 9th. Prior to Arcs of Omen, the system would be that you could take, say, a detachment of Space Marines alongside a detachment of Imperial Guard, representing the two forces fighting together, though increasingly throughout 9th edition there were good reasons that you wouldn't want to do this, such as ruining the detachment-specific special rules, like say Space Marines losing their powerful combat doctrines. It seems though that 10th edition is not going to allow you to do this. It looks like it's going the same way as Arcs of Omen did, and at least for core Warhammer 40k, you're just going to be taking one army based of one faction, so no say taking half Space Marines and half Guardsmen, it would be either one or the other. It looks like the only main way that you're going to be able to take allies in the core rules is to have the units that are notable in the fluff for being allied to other forces. Things like a single Imperial Knight Freeblade attached to another Imperial army, some sort of summoned Chaos Demons mechanic, and Brood Brothers for the Genestealer cults. I'd guess this is going to very closely resemble the Battle Brothers rules in Arcs of Omen at the moment, though I guess there's always going to be possibilities for some surprises, some things included or left out. Again, this is going to kind of suck if you have built up an army that's basically half of one thing, half of the other. I'd say for the most part, though, generally people tend to focus on individual armies as opposed to a weird mix like you could do in most of 8th. I feel like the system in 9th edition, though, was generally kind of fine. It basically meant that you could, on paper, ally most Imperial things to each other, but most of the time you just wouldn't want to, as you lose some really powerful special rules for the individual components. Obviously, nothing to stop you in more casual games running two different forces alongside each other. There wouldn't be anything wrong with that. And I'd still say that this system is a lot more preferable compared with going back to, say, the Nightmare of 7th edition, where you could have some very weird combos like, say, Tau Battlesuits and Space Marines joining each other's squads, and competitive lists having some very janky combos indeed. Finally, for the big army construction preview, we've also got a few more details on how we might enhance characters for Warhammer 40k. And this sounds like it's going to be the thing to replace the relics and warlord traits at the moment. Instead of getting either of those, you just get one single upgrade called an enhancement, and that can either represent a relic or a command ability that the model has. The name's the same as the upgrade that you can get in Warhammer 40k boarding actions, so I guess that was a bit of a foreshadow of things to come there. And it does sound like you only get one of these per character, as opposed to being able to layer on multiple different enhancements to them, so it sounds like more stats character combos where you say combine a fighty warlord trait and relic might just not be quite as big a deal. Obviously any single upgrade though could still be absolutely massively strong if they wanted it to be, it just depends on what rules they write. In terms of choices, they confirmed that Space Marine Gladius force would have 4 of them to pick from, though I don't think that we know whether or not there'll be any generic options in the core book for them. There were in some previous editions, but I'm not 100% sure if there will be in this one. They also say that 3 characters can take an enhancement, so I guess at least you're not locked to just the one warlord trait per army now. And at the moment there's no clear hint that you'd have to pay things like command points for them, so it might just be something that you get baked in. I suppose that will be one incentive to take something like 3 characters in your army list, but then you might have some slightly more diminishing returns if you take more that don't get enhancements. Another thing that I'm curious about is whether or not the epic heroes will get one of their own baked in, whether or not you'll even be able to buy enhancements for those, or whether they might get things like their own unique warlord traits down on the bottom of their datasheet, things like the way that Angron and Lord Invocatus had on theirs at the moment. It does say that as well as enhancements, you still get to select one model to be your warlord. Don't know how much relevance that's going to have. It might still be that special characters get their own unique warlord trait, or it could just literally be a choice, something to do with how you might score missions. Say your opponent might be able to get a kill point if they killed a warlord perhaps. Overall, again, I feel like this could add up to a bit of a loss of flavour. You don't get the big banks of relics and warlord traits that might unlock different ways to play your army. Though again, admittedly, throughout 9th edition, you often had armies that just wanted to take the same thing virtually every time, as there were clear choices that were easily the best. Still though, I feel like this might tone down the flavour of certain characters at least a little bit. I think it is quite fun theory crafting characters with interesting different bits of kit, though I guess at least this way they might be a little bit easier to balance. I guess it's harder to keep different choices balanced against each other if there's certain options where you can combine multiple things on one great unit, and the synergy of the stacking parts makes something monstrous out of rules that might individually be quite tame. So anyway, overall this really is quite a massive change to Warhammer 40k's army construction, and I must admit a fair bit of this went further down the simplification route than I thought they would, basically removing wholesale chapter-style sub-factions, the force organisation chart, allies as they have been throughout most of 8th and 9th, some stacking character combos, and power level in general. I feel like the overall result is probably going to shift a lot more focus onto the actual rules on the unit's datasheets, more so than other things that might want you to take a certain unit over another, like army-wide special rules, objective secures, or which slots you have available in a force organisation chart. Overall, I definitely think that this will lower the barrier to entry to Warhammer 40k. The process is very simple and far less involved now, though I think that theory crafting and building Warhammer 40k lists is also likely to be a lot less deep as a result, far more just about what units you decide to bring, as opposed to having to weigh up a whole loads of benefits of trade-offs of other things. I still think it's going to be good fun though. Pretty quick, straightforward and easily understandable for how to build an army, and when they do get round to doing balance updates and things, I'd guess they'll be able to achieve some better internal balance just by altering the points on units, as so much more of the focus is on the actual unit stats. Let me know what you think though. How good are these changes? Does it make you excited for building 10th edition armies? And how much will you miss the various bits they've taken out of the game? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and releases, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below if you're interested in helping support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.